Commonwealth Secretariat, and I've been invited to share some perspectives from the Commonwealth about how we can build trade for development partnerships. I think there are two very important concepts involved in that, and that's trade for development and a partnership of equals between those countries that are negotiating. So for those who are not familiar with the Commonwealth, it's about 53 countries. It's a voluntary association. It's quite a mix of countries. It includes developed and developing, some of the world's richest countries, some of the world's poorest countries, water-linked countries, land-linked countries, small states, and even a large group of least developed countries. So I think there's quite a wealth of experiences around trade negotiations to be drawn from these countries, and particularly from their perspective. Because as the Commonwealth Secretariat, as these countries are our clients, we often provide them with technical assistance, capacity building, to develop their negotiating positions, to develop their trade policies. So I probably have a lot of secrets to share today, so Lars, you can close your ears. But I think it's everything you know as well and we know. But a perspective from them about the normative framework about how trade agreements should be negotiated. And then there's also another important aspect. Apart from assisting those countries that are negotiating trade agreements, there's also the impact on those countries that are not participating, what's often called the excluded countries. And these are often the most capacity-constrained countries, and as the Secretariat, we also often take work to help them understand the impact of being outside of agreements and what the implications are so they can prepare themselves for the future. So everything I say is in my personal capacity, and these are my reflections having worked in the Secretariat and previously as a negotiator for the South African government. Just as an introduction, I think we're all aware of this, that the global trading landscape is rapidly changing, it's rapidly evolving, particularly with the emergence of regional trade agreements. I think we all know that they are now established features of the global trading landscape. You can see there was a surge in RTAs, only 50 till 1990, and most recently in April 2015, 612 of these agreements notified to the World Trade Organization. The emergence particularly of mega regionals or mega RTAs like TTIP, TPP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia, could become major game changers for the whole system. And I think that's very important that we think about these. But overall, the European Union is historically the most successful example of regional integration, despite some of the debates that are going on at the moment about Brexit and Grexit. And if we look at the EU's negotiations, as Lars has indicated, you find very ambitious trade negotiations, like the TTIP, like the EU-Korea. I understand the EU-Korea is even more advanced than the US-Korea agreement in terms of the liberalization commitments. But you also find less ambitious agreements and more traditional negotiations, which is particularly with the African, the Caribbean, and the Pacific countries. And the question I ask is why perhaps is there this disjuncture between these very ambitious agreements versus the more traditional agreements, the more limited trading goods agreements, which have largely been found with the ACP in terms of the economic partnership agreements. So I have some ideas based on listening to our clients and our own experience as a South African negotiator. I think overall, if you want to listen to developing countries, their overall priority is structural economic transformation. There is a concern that when they negotiate trade agreements and they negotiate free trade agreements, they lock themselves into a static comparative advantage without allowing for dynamic comparative advantage, dynamic competitive advantage to diversify their economies. If you look at the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth members, most of our economies are small markets. They have very narrow production bases. Their exports are concentrated in a few primary products and minerals and commodities. And for them, particularly the African group, the overarching priority really is to shift onto a more sustainable growth path, which moves beyond growth driven by commodities and minerals and onto industrial development. There's also a recognition that services do play an important role, both services as an export in their own right, but also the important role that services play as an enabler for many of these developing countries to participate more gainfully in regional and global value chains. So I think that's the first point around structural transformation. The second, and I think that's the big secret, is that many of our clients in the Commonwealth are saying that market access is important, but the big factor is productive capacity. And we've seen that in the export profile of a lot of our members. If one looks at the Pacific Islands Group, for instance, two of their largest exports to the EU are palm oil and tuna. And if one looks at over the last few years, their exports of palm oil have actually declined from 12% of the EU's total imports of palm oil to 9%, while tuna exports have only marginally increased from 4% to 5%, also over a 5-year period. So there really is this issue of productive capacity, being able to supply markets where there is readily available market access through a range of preferences, but producing and supplying that in a very reliable and accurate manner. So a critical factor for participating in global value chains is also raising the productive capacity and the ability to produce and export. And when it comes to trade agreements, what our clients are telling us that there is a role for policy space and the kinds of policy instruments to develop industries, to diversify your economy, and aid for trade. And a few years ago, one would probably be sacrilege to talk about industrial policy, but increasingly everyone is bringing it back. Even the World Bank today talks about industrial policy, the importance of productive policies for the economy, and I think that's a very important element that needs to be integrated into trade agreements, and I'll come back to that a bit later. Third is the importance of enhancing competitiveness, because many of our clients are not very competitive in the goods and the services they produce. There's certainly a domestic reform agenda at play where governments have autonomous policy options to look at reforming their regulations, their laws, their policies to increase competitiveness. It's important to address behind the border issues, the traditional issues like investment, competition, services, but also increasingly going into the issue of standards. What we are finding that today competitiveness is really driven by the ability to trade on standards and your capacity to meet high international standards. Part of the challenge is that international standards are today increasingly set by lead firms, private industry in global value chains. And whether these are voluntary or mandatory, they are effectively mandatory for countries to participate in these standards if they are going to get shelf space on retailers, in warehouses, and distribution networks. So certainly a role for aid for trade there as well. Trade enabling infrastructure. For a mix of our clients in the Commonwealth, many of them confront extremely high trade costs. If you think of the Pacific Island countries, I challenge you to find Kiribati or Vanuatu or even Fiji on a map. Very far, very distant from their major markets, high costs, poor infrastructure connections, limited connections. And there is a question about what role could trade agreements play to enable better infrastructure connections, particularly by leveraging aid for trade and other development assistance. Advancing regional integration has become a major priority for all our clients in the Commonwealth. We've seen, particularly in Africa, what they call developmental regionalism, and the growing significance of this reflected in both regional negotiations and the need to emphasize support for regional integration with external trading partners. This idea of developmental regionalism really says that the major challenges to growing intra-African trade is not necessarily tariffs or regulatory barriers, but poor infrastructure and undiversified production structures. So it really brings back this whole development paradigm of market access, infrastructure, and industrial development into one fold. One hears what African countries are saying, particularly in terms of the in terms of the EPAs that have been negotiated. Their priority is first to build regional markets, particularly in regional rules, before necessarily opening up to external trading partners. Obviously, that is a priority that they need to fulfill. Certainly, they are lagging in many respects when it comes to building common regimes around competition policy, investment services, but that's the priority that has been expressed. And one finds that in the ACP economic partnership agreements with the African group, most of them are only goods-only agreements versus CARIFORUM, for instance, which is a very comprehensive agreement. And then finally are the institutional and governance challenges which confront many of the poorer countries. Here obviously is the issue of asymmetrical bargaining power. You often find that poorer capacity-constrained countries do not hold all the cards when it comes to negotiations. They have limited ability, limited capacity to influence the negotiations, to shape them to their preferred outcomes. Some of their external partners hold all the cards, financial power, market access power. I think it's also important to recall that when it comes to trade negotiations, it's the importing country and the market which often holds all the cards and provides the concessions. There's the need for capacity building, particularly when it comes to trade negotiations, understanding the impact of trade agreements on economies, using those impact assessments to formulate negotiating positions, and then obviously the adjustment costs that come with negotiations and trade agreements once they're implemented. So it's a question we were asking for instance, using economic partnership agreements, are these partnerships for development? I don't have an answer, and like most things in life, the answer probably lies somewhere between yes and no. But if one looks at the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, listening to some of our African clients, they've often said that there's perhaps a competing paradigm around development. The Cotonou Partnership Agreement emphasized the smooth and gradual integration of ACP countries into the world economy, poverty reduction and sustainable development. And there was a feeling that in the negotiations on the European side, perhaps there was a more stronger emphasis on the integration into the world economy, while African negotiators had a stronger emphasis on the latter two, poverty reduction and sustainable development. Again, like in most things in life, the answer probably lies somewhere in between. And each group was negotiating and pursuing their legitimate interests. But what we see the outcome being is that there is a comprehensive agreement negotiated with CARIFORUM, which includes the goods section, but also all the new generation trade issues, even including things like e-commerce. One looks at what the impact of that agreement has been. Challenges come to mind. We've just done some research around the impact of the CARIFORUM. Certainly, there has been improved market access, but again, the CARIFORUM countries lack the productive capacity to often fill the market access that is available. When it comes to the liberalization of services, certain restrictions still when it comes to mutual recognition or the approval of visas to travel to the European Union. One looks at Africa, compared to the comprehensive agreement which was negotiated in CARIFORUM, this is only a goods-only agreement with many rendezvous clauses to later negotiate many of the new generation issues. So that's the question, is that sufficient, though, for a partnership for development? Certainly the African EPAs do provide considerable policy space to address many of those issues that I raised earlier in terms of a normative framework for development. But I think the lesson that we take is that trade success today ultimately depends less on preferences and less on tariffs, and more on the ability to compete, and also the ability to compete on private and public standards in world trade. Just looking at some of the select examples, for instance, from the SADC and the ECOWAS EPAs, I think some very interesting cases of where policy instruments have been made available to African countries to pursue these normative objectives of structural economic transformation, productive capacity, competitiveness, and so forth. For example, if one looks at the need to structurally transform your economy, moving from commodities towards industrialization, you find that, again, the market access is there. The European Union provides duty-free, quota-free market access for all goods, with the exceptions of arms and munitions. If one looks at the ECOWAS and the SADC EPA, for instance, there still is considerable space to carve out exceptions to liberalization and considerable time, 20 years, within which to liberalize. So the ECOWAS liberalizes 75% of its tariffs over a period of 20 years. SADC liberalizes 80%. At the same time, there's also a protocol on geographical indications that provide policy space to South Africa to safeguard some of its brand names for export to the European Union. If one looks at productive capacity, certainly a lot of policy space provided in terms of trade defense instruments, largely safeguard measures that have been included. Export taxes are permitted under particular circumstances, either for revenue, for infant industry protection, or for environmental protection. The flexible rules of origin allowing accumulation, particularly when it comes to clothing and textiles, the elimination of agricultural exports. So certainly I think in terms of some of the first two priorities of structural transformation and building productive capacity, there has been an appreciation of the challenges which many African countries confront, and these have, in a hard negotiation, and often very acrimonious negotiation, resulted in some policy space for developing countries, in this regard African countries, to pursue their public objectives. When it comes to enhancing of competitiveness, one finds that in the African economic partnership agreements, there are no formal commitments to undertake commitments in services, investment, competition, procurement, but rendezvous clauses to revisit these issues at a later stage. And I think that is quite critical that African countries do start considering the negotiation of these issues. As I said earlier, they're very important when it comes to integrating into global value chains. One of the biggest challenges which African countries confront is high transport costs, for instance. That is not going to be resolved by reducing tariffs. That really requires looking behind the border at competitiveness issues, distribution networks, and so forth. Regional integration, I think if one looks at the two EPAs, SADC, for instance, has a standalone chapter on regional integration, which I think is is a very important victory for the SADC group, but also an appreciation from the European Union side on the importance of regional integration to African countries. So explicit reference to support for SACU, SADC and the African Union. Implementation and governance, we find also this is one of the biggest issues when it comes to trade adjustment and the costs for implementing the economic partnership agreements. Substantial funds have been set aside in terms of EPA development programs. If one looks at some of the recent estimates coming from the CARI Forum, I think there is still a financing gap between the actual estimated costs of adjustment and what has been put forward from the other side, from the European Union to support implementation of the agreement. So there's certainly scope for dialogue and partnership in that regard. Just some final thoughts, and this is where we as the Secretariat have also played quite a strong role, is what are the implications for the outsiders, for those excluded countries that are often not participating in agreements? And it's an interesting question, because when two parties come together and legitimately negotiate a trade agreement, why should they worry about the impact on others? And it would be very interesting whether impact assessments undertaken by these parties also look at the implications for countries outside. But what we find is that the European Union is an important trading partner for many of the Commonwealth countries. And many Commonwealth countries are also negotiating FTAs with the European Union or are not participating. And I think if one looks at the economic literature, we're all familiar that regional trade agreements will create trade for those participating and divert trade for those that are not participating. But obviously the impact of this would really depend on the level and the structure of trade, how sensitive trade is to particular prices, certain sectors would be differentially impacted. So what we've been doing as a Secretariat is some work on mega regional trade agreements, or what's known as the TTIP, TPP and RCEP, and what the impact would be on parties that are excluded. It's not only the mega regionals, but we've also looked, for example, previously at the impact of the EU-India trade agreement.